Hi students. For this lecture we're going to talk about how to manually test and debug an ASP.NET Core web application. So that's chapter 5 in our book. So this module is a little bit shorter than the rest. Hopefully you'll take the extra time to reflect on what we've learned through the first 4 weeks as well as this chapter. And then you'll have your first major assignment that will hopefully put together a lot of what we've learned so far with being able to use the MVC engine to display our web pages as well as hook our application up to a data store, a database. So I'm just going to go over a few high points over this PowerPoint presentation. Before we move on, I don't want to go through every single slide as you have access to it. So as we know, the MVC pattern is a client-server architecture pattern to where we offer up commands to our server such as put, post, get, requests, and then the server then deciphers that, figures out which controller route to call, and passes back an HTML view that the browser then reads or deciphers and then displays it to the user of the Chrome or Edge or whatever browser is your favorite. So there's a couple things that there's a couple debuggers that we need to learn how to use in order to effectively debug our web applications. So some of the objectives for this include manually testing your web application in multiple browsers. So every single browser we use deciphers HTML a little bit differently, and that's why some websites work better than others on certain browsers. It's because maybe the developers that developed the website were using maybe a certain browser when they were testing it, or maybe a certain 2 or 3 browsers. Some browsers may not keep up with some of the new things that HTML can do, or maybe they might not keep up with some of the new syntax, so they might fall behind. So we're going to use Visual Studio. I'm going to use Visual Studio to debug, and then after we use Visual Studio, I'll switch over to Visual Studio Code as well. And then we'll also use the 3 commands, step over, step into, and step out, which hopefully you should have already used before in the C# class. So a lot of this shouldn't be too new, as we should have already used the Visual Studio debugger in the contemporary programming course. So let's go ahead and move on to the next slide. So I will say, as far as chapters in the book are concerned, I'll say that this chapter is probably one of the more important chapters in the fact that I hope you read it in such a way that you make sure you take away a good 80 or 90% of what the chapter has to offer. If we go over routing or entity framework or anything like that, if you take away a good 50 or 60% of that chapter, and you can speak to it and you can understand what it's doing, I think you did a pretty good job. The rest you can go back and kind of better understand when you run into a certain problem or something like that. But this chapter, really you need to ingrain it in your memory, in your head. That way your debugging is a lot easier, and you use all of the tools available to you in Visual Studio when you go ahead and you run into an issue. So this slide shows us how to change our default browser. It's pretty simple, and I'll go ahead and just demonstrate that in Visual Studio as well. Just simply selecting the drop-down. So we already know this drop-down here at the top of your Visual Studio window allows us to run our application. And also the drop-down menu gives us a few choices as to how we'd like to do that. So we've already spoke about it a little bit when we talked about the introduction to MVC. We talked about reverse proxies and Kestrel and IIS. So IIS is essentially what we use to run our application, especially on a Windows server. So if we're using Windows Server 2019 or whatever the most recent version of Windows Server is, typically we'll put our application within IIS, which is Internet Information Services. And then that'll run our application, and that'll traffic all of the requests on our web server coming into our application. So if say google.com is written in ASP.NET Core MVC, which it's not, but let's just pretend for a second that it is, that google.com instance would be running inside IIS, and then whenever you type in google.com, the traffic then will route to that specific instance of IIS, and then be able to traffic requests that way, and be able to maybe it's load balanced, so maybe there's a couple different Windows servers running it. Google is a huge website, so it's probably running in like every country at least one time on different web servers. And then, so IIS is what that is, and Kestrel is simply a reverse proxy to IIS. So that's what that is. Let me see, make sure we're not missing anything else. So another thing I'm going to go over during this lecture is the Chrome and the Elements tab. Chrome does have some very, very good debugging, and it's very transparent and easy to use as long as you can read HTML, and you can use everything here that there is to offer, which we'll go over. Here's the internal server error page. So for whatever reason, you're trying to do something that Visual Studio doesn't like, and it encounters an exception, it'll come to this internal server error page. I'm sure people have probably seen a page somewhat like this before. A website they're using maybe times out or something, and you get a really ugly page back. ASP.NET Core MVC does the same thing, where if you make a call to your web server and then it is unable to make a request back, or it's unable to send a response, it'll send this response instead, essentially a 500 response. So if anybody remembers the HTTP codes or is familiar with the HTTP codes, typically 500, the codes in the 500 ranges are all exceptions or error codes. The codes in the 400 ranges are typically things like not found. If the resource isn't found, everybody should be familiar with like a 404 not found. 200 codes are codes like okay, I was able to process the request. 201 is I was able to process the request, but there was no information. So all of those HTTP codes that come back to your web browser try to give us some information as to how the request was processed. You can see all of those HTTP codes. You can Google the HTTP codes, and you can probably find them about anywhere on the internet. There's way too many to remember, and they're coming up with new ones all the time. Here's the exception helper. Hopefully everyone has encountered an exception before in Visual Studio. I'm not saying that because you write bad code. I'm saying that because that's how you learn. So you learn by writing some code and then encountering an exception and then learning how this window works and all of the things you can click. So I'll try to replicate an exception to show us this window here in a second. And then you'll probably come across it one or more times, and you'll tell me, hey Dylan, I'm running into an issue. I don't know where to start. And then the first thing I'll say is, did you set a breakpoint? Because if you set a breakpoint, you know exactly where your code is failing and exactly why your code is failing, as long as you step through your code, whether it be a null reference exception or a database exception or any sort of exception that occurs. If you set a breakpoint before the exception occurs, you should see the state that the code is in before the exception is run into. So we'll go over again how to create an exception, create breakpoints, and create conditional breakpoints. So maybe you only want to stop your code if this certain condition exists, as well as creating trace points, which is just a way to write out to the output window some tidbit of information maybe when you reach a certain point in your code. So that's about it as far as the PowerPoint is concerned. We'll also go over the watch windows at the bottom of the screen when it's in break mode, as well as the immediate window, which will show us all of our variables that we have currently in scope, as well as we can also run in the immediate window what certain variables have in them at a certain point in time, which is pretty cool to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and exit out of this PowerPoint presentation, or at least move it over here, so I can keep track of where I'm at. So the first thing I'd like to do is have this little drop down come down. You can see I can run this in different web browsers. So Internet Explorer, I recommend you never choose this one. Firefox, Microsoft Edge. So I usually just run everything in Google Chrome. It has a really good inspector window. It has really good developer tools. I also looked at Microsoft Edge and actually the new version of Edge. If you can see down here, here's the new version of Edge. So this will kind of show you if you have the new version of Microsoft Edge or not. They changed their logo. It's no longer the Internet Explorer E that kind of looks a little cooler. It's now this cool wave looking thing. So I typically do a lot of my stuff in Edge now. It's actually almost on par with Chrome. That's just my own tidbit of information. So if you don't agree, that's fine. So I'm going to go and continue because I trust the Google Chrome developer tools. So I'm going to leave it on Google Chrome for now. I'm going to go ahead and run it. So one thing that I did forget to mention, and I don't know if I can go back and do it again or not. It doesn't look like it. Let me go ahead and stop it. So if we want to stop debugging, we can pause debugging. We can restart the debugger. So I'm just going to go ahead and stop it. And if I bring down this movie list again, you can see that I have a couple options here. I have IIS Express. So if you remember us talking about it, there is a full version of IIS. Which is what our app will run on an actual web server. And IIS Express is what comes with Visual Studio as kind of a slimmed down version of IIS, a quick version of IIS to run on our local machine. And then we also have this movies list, which will run with a reverse proxy in front of it, a Kestrel reverse proxy. So these are just the two profiles we have. And these profiles aren't made up. They actually exist in this launch.json file. So if I go to this launch.json, and this is where, here's our IIS settings. So this is essentially saying whenever we try to launch the website, this is what I want you to do. And here are the two profiles that I want to have available to the person running the application. So here's the IIS Express. Launch browser is true. ASP.NET Core environment is a development. As you can see in the movies list one, we have which URLs we want to go to. So if I use the drop down, I hit the IIS Express and hit start. It shouldn't give us too much different of a feel. It should pretty much be the same. Okay, so now here's our website. So now we're in debug mode. I also have like another window that pops up. This is just the debug console. You can see I can hit any key to close this window, but I'm just going to leave the window up while I'm debugging. So if you're trying to access the debug tools, the developer tools within Chrome, so there's two sets of tools we need to learn how to use. The first set is in Visual Studio, excuse me. So that debugs the server-side code. This debugs our controllers, our models. We can do a little bit of debugging on our views if it's the C# code, but if it's HTML code, we really can't do too much with the HTML. The HTML, we need to come to Chrome or whichever version you're using, whichever browser you're using, and come to View Page Source or Inspect. So I right-click on the page, and I can inspect it, and I actually have it popping up in a new window right now. How do I put that in the same window again? I think it might be here. Yeah, I need to dock it. So let me dock it on my window. So that's how you can put it in the same window if you don't want to have it in two different windows. And this will show you all the elements on your page. Here's the head element, so all of the elements that we have that are putting in our CSS, our title, our meta tags, any JavaScript that we might have in here. And here's our body tag, which is actually the CSS that's displaying. So you can see as I hover over everything, it gives me all of the CSS elements that are on it as well. So I have a table head, table body, table row, table row. So you can see as I scroll through with my mouse cursor, it highlights what element that is on my page. So if something isn't displaying it like you would expect it to display, make sure you come over and inspect the page and see why it's not displaying as you would like. You can see as I'm hovering over the header that it has a lot of padding. So if I click on header, it'll change the context of my developer tools, and you can see that the padding that it has here, the green space. And if you're confused as to what the color means around your elements, you can come to the right-hand side and scroll down of styles, and then it'll give you a little key as to what everything is on your element. So here's the actual element right in the middle, and then so you can see that there's a lot of padding on it. Padding is green. There's no border, and then here's the margin. There's just some margin on the bottom. That's 32. There's also a console window, so if anything is going wrong in JavaScript or jQuery or anything like that, it'll show up in the console window. If you go to websites, big websites, large websites, and you right-click and go to the console, there might be a lot of errors in there in JavaScript. Maybe it can't find a JavaScript file. A JavaScript file might be out of date. A JavaScript file might be vulnerable. There's a lot of different things that can pop up in this console window. You can also run JavaScript here as well, as long as you have JavaScript that came into your project. So if you have JavaScript in your project, you can run JavaScript from the console. Here are all of the sources. So these are all of the Bootstrap files and CSS files that came along with your web page. Your web page came along. It has the header. It has the header with your CSS in it, and then it points to these CSS files that MVC sends with your web page. You can actually see the CSS on the client side. Here's the Bootstrap CSS. I was looking to see if there's any application CSS. It looks like they just use Bootstrap. We have our network tab, which shows us, if I go ahead and do a refresh, right now it's not going to show us anything on the network tab, but if it should show me, if I refresh it, it should show me this going out to the server or my website, and then returning. Yep, there it goes. So all I did was hit refresh, and you can see that it goes out to the local host, which is my local machine, and it returns a 200 here, and it will show you all of the other information. The request was sent. It took 0.19, maybe that's milliseconds or something. So you can see all of the information that came along with your request. This is especially useful whenever you're doing things like web services. So if you have a web service, this is pretty useful. You can see if there's a 500 error, exactly why there was a 500 error, and it will show you the error here. If there's a 404 not found, maybe a resource was not found. Whenever I tried to go out and get a resource from my server, it'll display here which resource was not found. And then, so as we go further to the right, a lot of these are used less and less. So those are the 4 ones that I typically use the most. There's some performance in Chrome, but typically you deal more with performance on the server side than I do on the client side. Memory. Sometimes I'll come to this application page. You can see all of your CSS again here. You can see what it was cached on our web page. You can see if you have cookies available. If you set a cookie on your website, you can see that here. And then any security certificates you can see under the security overview here. There's also a console on the bottom of the web page, and you can clear the console and show the console sidebar, as well as many other things that pop up here to use. So there's many different tools we can use to debug the client side, which is essentially what the user sees. So our user interface, and they're all the same. They're typically pretty close together between our browsers. So if I go back and try to launch this in Edge, so the developer tools will be a bit different between between browsers, but they're still fairly usable. What's it doing? Okay, I picked Edge. Let's go ahead and go back to Kestrel and run our web page. Okay, so now we're in Edge. I'm going to go ahead and inspect again. And now when I inspect, you can see that the developer tools are quite similar to what they were in Chrome. Here's our elements again. It seems like they almost ripped the developer tools out of Chrome and put them in Edge, which is nice because I really like the developer tools in Chrome. We have our sources again. We have our network tab. You can see that it's pretty much identical. I don't think I have Firefox installed to show you the Firefox tools, but if you have Firefox installed, let's see if I do. Let's go ahead and start it. What's going on here? Import, don't import anything. Okay, so I must have Firefox installed, but I must never use it. Let's go ahead and try to run it again. Okay, so here's Firefox Advanced. So it doesn't trust that I'm running this locally. So here's Firefox. It's a little different. You can inspect element, view page source, and you can see the developer tools pop up from the bottom on Firefox, but they still have the same inspector window, console window. They have a window called debugger, and then the network window is all the way on the right. So there's parity in all of them. You can pick whichever browser developer tools you like the best. It's usually always highly advised to use a browser that is used the most. That way people actually want to use your website if they use Chrome or Edge or whatever the case may be. So I showed us the launch settings.json, and in Visual Studio, all of those actually compile down into, if I come here and I do debug properties, that'll actually pull from the launch settings.json. You can see all of your debug properties here as well in Visual Studio. It's not as straightforward in Visual Studio Code. Really, the only thing you have is the launch settings.json, as well as I forget what the file's called now. Let me open it. You have the launch settings.json and tasks.json. So this is launch.json and task.json inside of VS Code, and that tells Visual Studio Code how to launch your application, which browser to use when they launch it, which processes to use. So you can see that we build, we publish, we process, and run it. So we use the .NET run command. Launch.json gives a little more information as to the current working directory of where your application is, the DLL or the program that you want to run whenever you want your application to run. Typically all of this is done for you, so you don't have to really understand a lot about what this is. There's the ASP.NET Core environment that you're running at this point in time. So this is all of the configuration that it uses when it launches it in Visual Studio Code. So if you remember Visual Studio Code, we simply come over here and click on Launch.NET Core. We can add different configurations here, which will add a configuration, you can see, to our launch.json settings, whether or not you want to attach it to an Edge process, a Chrome process, or whatever the case may be. I'm going to go ahead and undo that. And then running in Visual Studio Code, you can also add a configuration here if you wanted to launch it in some different window. But typically it just pops up in your default browser in Visual Studio Code. Visual Studio Code is pretty much the same as Visual Studio. You can also set breakpoints in Visual Studio Code as well. So I'm going to come over here in my controller, my home controller. I can set a breakpoint here. I can right click. I can remove the breakpoint. I can edit the breakpoint. So maybe if I only want it to set a conditional breakpoint, so only break maybe when something evaluates to true, I can do that here. I can also log a message. This is essentially my trace point. And then we can see in Visual Studio they have those same options as well. So if I come here and I want to set a breakpoint, so now it highlights in red the breakpoint that I've set in my home controller. I can right click, I can delete the breakpoint, I can set a condition on that breakpoint to only break when a certain condition exists. I can right click, I can click actions, and then I can set a trace point. So these are the actions that I want to occur. So maybe show a message in the output window. I have hit the index action of the home controller. Close. And you can see when I make a trace point, it's more of a diamond now than it was a circle with a breakpoint. So now I can come over to my controller. Let me set a breakpoint here. Let's go ahead and run my application using Kestrel. Failed to bind. I must already have this running in Visual Studio Code. Yeah, I do. Exit out of this. Let's try that again. Okay, so now that I closed it in Visual Studio Code, we can see that I've now hit a breakpoint here. I don't know why I still have this going in Firefox. Am I still using Firefox? Let's stop doing that. Let's go back to Google Chrome. All right, now Visual Studio is yelling at me, hey, you have a breakpoint. If you remember the things we can do in Visual Studio, we can step into, we can step over, we can step out. So step into is stepping into a method. If you want to step into a method call, we can do F11. If we want to step over a line of code, so we're currently at this curly brace, I'm going to F10 to step over that curly brace. And now I'm at movies equals context.movies. So movies is a property, and I should be able to step into one of these. So if I hit F11, I'm going to step into. Doesn't look like it's going to let me step into it since it's a link expression. Automatic step over. Okay, so it still let me step into it. So you can see F11, I'm allowed to step into this on model creating. I can F10 and step over lines of code, F10, 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 and then I'm over to my genre model now. I'll go ahead and F10 through that. It's going to make me get every single piece of the model. I want to continue F10ing until I reach here. Did it ever run my trace point? There's my locals, there's my watch. Let me see what I got here. I'm not seeing where it ran my trace point. Okay, I found it. So in the output window, you can see that I have a trace point. I have hit the index action of the home controller in the output window, so that's where my trace point came in. So you can kind of keep track where you are in the code in the output window. I don't typically use trace points. They don't add a lot of value, any more value than breakpoints already do. So you can see if you hover over variables, you can also see what's inside of a variable. You can also dig deeper into the variable via the down arrow. You can also go to your window down here for autos, locals, and watch to also dig further into all of the variables that you have currently on your application. So here's the movies variable again in my locals window. I can also go to the immediate window and figure out exactly what everything is. So if I go to movies, you can see that now I have some IntelliSense, so it'll help me with the code that's currently in context. And if I go to movies 0 and hit enter, it'll give me what that movie is in the immediate window. So it's a lot of different ways to kind of do the same thing. It all depends on how you like to use it. Maybe you can also change in the immediate window. You can change things. So if I go to movies 0.genre, I don't want it to be, well, let's not change genre since it's a enum. Let's change the rating of Casablanca. I don't want it to be 5. I want it to be a 3. I didn't think it was that great of a movie. So now you can see I actually changed something in the immediate window. So now if I look at the movies again, now I can see that I changed the rating to 3. So maybe I want to see if something breaks. I can do that in the immediate window. Maybe I want to see if 3 breaks my code. So I can do a little bit more testing without actually having to change my data. I can just change it inside of Visual Studio using the immediate window, which is pretty cool. Okay, now that we went over all the windows and everything in Visual Studio, I want to go ahead and try to break it so we can see what happens when our program breaks. So we have a movies context. We set the context here via dependency injection. I'm going to go ahead and set it back to null right before we use it. That should give us a null reference exception here. Okay, so let's go ahead and try to run it. We can see we've hit now a null reference exception. So this is the window that pops up whenever an exception occurs. So something in your code broke. Visual Studio didn't expect it to happen. You didn't account for it. So here we go. We can see we can view details. And this is typically what I use most. You can copy details maybe if you want to go to Stack Overflow or something and see what the issue is. This will kind of pop up something like our debug window does whenever we search through an object. What we're searching through now is the exception object. So here we can get more information on the exception that occurred. So from there, we can see the enter exception, which is basically the exception's message. Or we can see the message if it's just a single exception. So maybe if the exception has an exception within it, you can see that here. Otherwise, if there's just a single exception, you can see the message here. You can also see the stack trace if you want to figure out exactly which method broke. You can view the stack trace here, as well as some other less important piece of information as well. Most of the time you'll just use the message and the stack trace to figure out what broke in your application. If you're still confused as to what broke, it's usually good practice just to copy it from here, paste it into Google and see if you can find any information in Stack Overflow. Reach out to me, maybe I've seen the exception before, but typically, hopefully the exceptions that you see are exceptions that you ran into before, such as a null reference exception. Maybe a divide by 0 exception or something like that, or maybe you tried to access a resource that didn't exist. Whatever the case may be, hopefully you've seen the exception before. I'm going to go ahead and get rid of this line of code here so it works again. And that's about it. So that covers Chapter 5. Your assignment 0 is a pretty good culmination of all of the things we've learned so far in the course. So I hope that's just challenging enough for you this week to really be a good refresher on everything we've learned thus far. Reach out to me with any questions you have, and I hope you have a good week. Thanks.